Good morning. I'm Dorothy McAuliffe, one of the co-chairs of this amazing Global Women's Leadership Forum, if I say so myself, and it's amazing because of all the both participants on our panel, but also our attendees. So thank you all very much for being here this morning. I am delighted to welcome you to day 2 of the Women's Global Leadership Forum, hosted by the University of Virginia. Yesterday, we had 6 sessions which grappled with some of the most challenging issues facing women in the 21st century, in our democracy, our 21st century democracy: access to health and education, economic mobility and equity, and the political empowerment of women and girls around the world. We heard the compelling stories of a successful businesswoman who nearly won her country's presidency, and from another who became the first woman head of state in the modern Balkans at age 35, the youngest female leader ever in the world. We also heard from an exceptional group of emerging leaders who aspired to leadership in their own countries. And last evening, we celebrated the leadership of UVA's first woman president, Terry Sullivan. At breakfast this morning, we received a first-hand account from Alice Rubenstein about women leading the way in our last frontier, the Arctic. And now we are in the appropriate place, one of America's oldest public universities, at the right time in the life of the university, a time of celebration and reflection as we enter UVA's next 200 years. The right time and place to explore today's topic: change in the world, mobilizing millennials. Last year, the Pew Institute reported that millennials, those born between 1981 and 1997, represented 75.4 million young people and are now the largest group in the United States, surpassing Gen Xers and baby boomers. Our speaker today is a committed and enthusiastic expert on the topic of millennial engagement. Jean Case is the CEO of the Case Foundation, which has researched the millennial generation for almost a decade. The Case Foundation's 2017 Millennial Report, just published in September, is considered the guidebook for those focused on this key demographic. And since 2009, Jean and the Case Foundation have supported the Millennial Impact Project, measuring the minds of more than 100,000 millennials. This effort has resulted in a pivotal series of studies exploring how this generation connects, gives, and gets involved with the issues they care about. Jean Case is a philanthropist, an impact investor, and an early leader in cutting-edge interactive technologies. Before co-founding the Case Foundation 20 years ago, she was a senior executive at American Online, where she directed the marketing and branding efforts and helped establish AOL as a household utility. Jean and her husband Steve joined the Giving Pledge in 2010 and publicly reaffirmed their commitment to give away the majority of their wealth to fund worthy charitable causes. Additionally, Jean has generously donated her time to many worthy efforts, including the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society and the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. Jean is currently chair of the Board of Trustees of the National Geographic Society. In January 2017, the magazine published a remarkable special issue entitled Gender Revolution. Our conversation today with Jean is hosted by Christine Mahoney, a professor of public politics at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. She is the director of Entrepreneurship at UVA, where she founded and manages a new initiative that has introduced courses, established a minor, created scholarships, and provided opportunities for UVA students to have direct involvement in social innovation. Christine is also an accomplished author who traveled to 7 conflict zones around the world, in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, to do fieldwork for her book, Failure and Hope: Fighting for the Rights of the Forcibly Displaced. She was the program coordinator for the Young Africans Leaders Program, which became the Mandela Fellowship, and we're thrilled that a number of YALI alumni are here with us this morning. I know we're all looking forward to this conversation. Christine, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy. So we just heard a bit about how the Case Foundation has been doing some critical research that turned into the Millennial Action Project to better understand millennials, what drives them, gets them involved. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Millennial Action Report tells us about the stereotypes facing millennials and what gets them fired up?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a real joy to be on the UVA campus. And again, with you, Christine. I've spent time here. We've had many students come to our winery, which is up in Madison, some of you might know. That's been a lot of fun. We actually took a class there for a day and drank some wine too, so that was fun. But our millennial work really has spanned nearly a decade now. And Dorothy, you were so kind to refer to me as an expert on the generation. But my own view is you can't be an expert on something you're not truly a part of. What I really am is a champion of this generation. In more than a decade that we've been focused on them, researching, their attitudes, perceptions, behaviors. I've often referred to them as really the next greatest generation, and I believe that with all my heart. And I think some of our early, what I want to say, almost like reasons we wanted to get into this research is because the world was starting to see the generation as what they called slackers. If you remember this, it was not a good trend that was happening. And in the work I do, out in the field, working for change, working with young change makers, I had seen something totally different. I had seen a young generation that was idealistic, like all of the young generations before them, but they were committed to turning their idealism into action in ways we were just blown away by. So we said, we really need data here because what we're seeing on the ground is nothing like the reputation this generation has. And the data has sort of proven out and borne out a lot of what we believe about how they're changing the way change happens in the world. And it's exciting to see.
That is exciting. We know that what we've seen, there's many young people that, and we've just seen this in the past election, there's been some young people elected to office all over the country. But many millennials are drawn to more direct action through social entrepreneurship. And we have this program here. We have over 500 students per semester interested in this. And many of them are also interested in what you've been a leader in, which is impact investing. I know you've done a lot of work looking at how can we make policy more streamlined? How can we help grow on, impact investing? Can you tell us what's on the frontier in that space, and are you seeing millennials get involved there?
Yeah. So I think, the common space we share are these young change makers who are building enterprises to change the world. And so I came out of the private sector, as you heard. I had this really, truly privileged opportunity to be part of the internet revolution and build a great company. But when we co-founded the foundation and I became CEO at the start, I would look around in rooms and there were passionate, committed people focused on issues of our day, dogging our communities, dogging places around the world that had been there for a long time. These people were talented. They brought a lot of experience and perspective to it. But there were empty chairs because I didn't see entrepreneurs around the table. And I think what we came to believe because of our own experience in seeing the power of even one company influencing lives is that it's almost like, we're missing some oars if we're rowing in one direction. And those oars are business and entrepreneurs who can come and bring brilliant solutions to problems that have been dogging us for a long time. So I think that was sort of our first real focus on what would become our focus on impact investing. Just the idea that we need all sectors at the table, we need everyone rowing together. And for too long, when we think of social challenges, we think of government, we think of nonprofit, and we think of philanthropy. But we often don't include the role of business or entrepreneurs. So I'm excited at the change we've seen over the last decade, particularly as social entrepreneurship has come along. So we certainly have a new generation of entrepreneurs who are looking at challenges and saying, what companies, what products, what services can I build to make a better world, joined by a new class of investors who say, I want more than a financial return. In fact, it was on another college campus where I was lecturing on impact investing, was at Yale, their school of management. And this kid raises his hand in the back of the room, and I call on him. And he said, so here's what I don't understand. Why would you just settle for a financial return? And to me, it was a brilliant example of the difference between how this generation looks at our world and how my generation did, believing that all we really needed was a financial return and everything else was going to work out. Today, what I believe Next Gen and many social entrepreneurs see is an opportunity to match a financial return with a social return with this new generation of companies. I'm super excited by it.
It is exciting. Is there any that rise to your mind, these ideas of millennial social entrepreneurs with a great product idea?
Oh, sure. I mean, we are out there all the time, and so the Case Foundation champions impact investing more broadly as a movement. So our work is really trying to play a catalyst role. But separately, then, we use our personal investment to invest in many of these new enterprises. I'll give you an example of a couple of them. One, Revolution Foods, based on the West Coast, some of you may have heard of them, started by two young moms who saw what was being served. And I'm looking at Dorothy over here, who's done so much for our public schools and Share Our Strength in providing food security in Virginia. But what these young moms saw, and Dorothy has seen the company as well, and we have them here in Virginia now, is an opportunity to create healthy meals for our young children in school. And doesn't that just amaze you that I have to say that? Wouldn't it be a given that we would care about the nutrition we're putting in our public schools? So instead of getting, all bummed about it or protesting, they said, we can solve that. And they started a firm to basically provide what they call chef-crafted, kid-inspired meals. And today, they're in a number of states around the United States serving millions of fresh, healthy options for children that children love. In fact, one of my favorite things to do is to put up B-roll when I talk about them, where you see the kids just loving the food they're served and, their empty plates that they bring. So, there are several important things about the story of that business. This was two moms who were in the schools and seeing what their kids were eating. If they had been in some business office under fluorescent lights, it would have been hard to imagine the need for that company. Two young female entrepreneurs taking this company forward. They're doing it in Oakland, California, not in Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley isn't really thinking about the needs that really exist in different sectors around the United States. So we need entrepreneurs coming from different backgrounds, different sectors, to look at the problems and build brilliant solutions.
Well, it's interesting because I remember 2 years ago you came and you talked about your Be Fearless campaign. And so Jean shared with our social entrepreneurship at UVA students this idea that, these problems are big and they're hairy, but you can be bold and you can take risks. And I've heard that you are now thinking about doing a book related to the Be Fearless campaign.
That's
so
right.
Can you tell us, what are the principles of this idea of being fearless?
Sure. Well, I do spend a lot of time on college campuses, but I spend a lot of time also with corporate boards, big institutions, small organizations, nonprofits, et cetera. And, one of the things we did several years ago at the Case Foundation is kind of stopped and looked around and said, wait a minute here, like, in some cases, there are challenges that have been out there for a millennium. Malaria is a great example of that. Again, this was some number of years back, not making the progress you would hope to see, even though tons of talent and money chased it, okay? Or, some older problems that just exist. In other cases, dramatic breakthrough, transformational change. And so we said, boy, we really feel like we would do a better job if we understood what's the difference when things break out, where there's transformational change, and when they sort of just, sputter along over time. So we hired a firm, and they kind of went to school on this question. And really what we learned was there are 5 principles present where you see transformational change. And we can go through some of them, but that really was the beginning of our work called Be Fearless. And the idea really is it does take a certain fearlessness to look at a daunting challenge, and it doesn't have to be a global thing, it could be something in your neighborhood. But it takes a certain amount of fearlessness to have a big idea, to not accept just small incremental change, and that's the first principle. To take a risk or to experiment with it, to accept that failure might be an option, but if you fail, make failure matter, fail forward, keep going. To work with a collaborative group, we call it reach beyond your bubble. Find talents and perspectives that you don't have so you can eliminate blind spots as you try to address a situation. And then lastly, to let urgency conquer fear. And so there's an interesting, in my mind, crossover between our work with millennials and our Be Fearless work. Because particularly millennials who have the benefit of a privileged education, they've done really well as they've moved through life, sometimes have a fear of stepping away from that very successful track they're on. And I can relate to this because I had a moment in my own life which also influenced my desire to do this Be Fearless campaign, where someone pointed out to me, pretty late in life, Jean, you've mostly been doing things you know you're going to be good at. So what haven't you done that you might have done if you didn't fear failing? And I really believe that's true with many students that I work with, particularly, as I said, if you're at an elite privileged school. You know, they love their parents. You know, they don't want to disappoint their parents in many cases. They feel really good about their trajectory. And the idea of stepping away from that to try something radical and new is sometimes hard. So the Be Fearless principles are really meant for everyone, and they have application almost no matter what walk you have in life. I spend a lot of time, this is a women's conference, I spend a lot of time with women. It's an important message for women because, you know, I think as women, we tend to be a little more risk adverse. I never want to use gender, you know, like say it applies across the board, but a tendency is we're a little less comfortable with risk. And you know what? That's a beautiful thing because we have traditionally raised the children. And so we want to make sure we provide a protection. And, but you know, we're ferocious when it comes to protecting others or championing others. Like, don't get in the way of a woman if she's, you know, really championing someone else. So I think what the Be Fearless principle calls us all to, including women, including millennials, including, you know, men across the world, et cetera, is just dig deep. Get out of your comfort zone. Even if you're not sure, but you have a big idea, take it forward. And don't be afraid. Don't let failure stop you. And that really is the message of Be Fearless.
Fantastic. We heard from a candidate for the president of Iceland yesterday, and she was talking about how she really had to push herself to be fearless. So we see that sometimes in politics. Is there an example of a woman being fearless in the social entrepreneurship space that?
Oh my goodness, we have a ton of them. You know, I'll talk a little bit about a woman named Steph Spears. And she was raised by a mom on welfare and, you know, had a really tough upbringing. And what she remembers is when it came time to pay the electric bill, how her mom really struggled. And I can relate to this because I was raised by a single mom, the youngest of 4 children. We went through the same exact thing. How Steph is different than I am is Steph said, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to the next generation. So she built a company to provide solar farms that low-income people can share. Why does that matter? Because today it's quite a capital investment to get solar. To get solar, you actually have to own the property, right? Because they're going to put something on the property. Your landlords might not let you do that, and it wouldn't make sense economically for you to do it for your landlord's structure. Or in many cases, you might just even face the wrong way to take advantage of solar. So this really democratizes access to solar power. And to me, it's another great example of someone who lived a different background, saw a different set of problems, and said, we can do something about that. And to me, that fearless spirit that Steph has, we see time and time again out across the nation and truly around the world. Not the least of which are young women out there providing kind of a different view of what the future can look like.
And I believe that the audience can get involved in this process, right? They can actually share some stories
That's right.
of women that they might know that are being fearless.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be just women, Christine. Let me say, Christine mentioned that I am writing a book, and we're really kind of doing a crowdsourcing call for great fearless stories that some of you might know. And it might be about yourself, but it might be about someone else or an organization or a great movement you've seen. We have a site called findingfearless.org. We've had a lot of people bring us their stories. It's a short little template you fill out, very short, and then we have researchers who are going deeper if we find some really great things, and it's my intent to spotlight several of these in the book. And so the book will mostly be you know, stories that combine both a historical perspective but contemporary stories of fearlessness. And we want to do what we truly call everyday fearlessness, people out there in community that we might not have the chance to know about or hear about, and hold them up and spotlight their work.
And this is a big undertaking. What made you want to share these stories?
Well, you know, I think, as I said, we spend a lot of time out. We've actually been teaching these Be Fearless principles for some time. And I think what we have heard is that there's a growing thirst. And we think storytelling is important. You can teach a principle, but just like you're asking me, well, who are these entrepreneurs and what are you talking about here? It's actually the storytelling that brings this to life. And so I think that was the idea behind the book, is to try to bring great stories. And it's funny in our work, you know, how many times we hear, oh, I didn't know that. And so we're just really trying to uncover what we believe is, in some cases, an older generation, but in some cases, a newer generation of fearless people out there changing the world.
That's one thing we've seen here as well, that millennials are often very inspired by other millennials, right? If you can see somebody that's just a couple years older and they've started a social enterprise.
Absolutely.
Had major impact. So I think sharing those stories is really powerful.
Right, and I might say, we have some challenges on that front, and that is that I think most people are inspired by people that they see themselves in a little bit, right? And yet we have a great challenge in the United States because, as many of you know, it's venture capital that is the jet fuel for a lot of young firms that makes the difference between whether they sort of stay in the small business realm or they can really achieve scalable growth. And that's venture capital. So last year in the United States, 90% of venture capital went to men, only 10% to female founders, less than 1% to African American founders. 78% of venture capital went to just 3 places in the United States: New York, Massachusetts, and California, with the lion's share of that being California. So we really need to do a better job of making sure we're supporting entrepreneurs from all backgrounds, all sectors, all geographies, and frankly, entrepreneurs around the world as well. I mean, some of the brilliant businesses that we've seen on the road in Africa have as much application here as the United States as they do in Africa. But in many cases, Americans won't build those companies. So I think supporting, a broader base of entrepreneurs really will be the key to breaking through with new products and services and solutions for our communities more broadly.
And this idea of inclusive entrepreneurship, I think, is really critically important, both here locally and across the country. And we've seen this with it's interesting, with social entrepreneurship at UVA, we have it's pretty split. It's 50-50 male-female. But if we go to some of more of the traditional entrepreneurship workshops or a concept competition, you'll see mostly young men in the room. What can we do to change that idea that entrepreneurship is a guy's world?
So we started a campaign last year to address this. We were sitting, actually probably a few years ago now, we were sitting around our conference room and we were bemoaning that when you hear the word entrepreneur, too often the image is a white guy in a hoodie. And anytime I say that, I want to say, we love our white guys in hoodies, okay? But entrepreneurs are more than just that. So we said, all right, well, let's just Google successful entrepreneur and see what comes up. So we went to Google Images. It was entirely men. There wasn't one woman that came up under the Google search for successful entrepreneur. So we screen captured it because we didn't want to forget that day. And we said, it's going to be our goal that in the future when this comes up, it is truly a beautiful rainbow of backgrounds and colors and gender. And so we started this campaign, Faces of Founders, which was a social media campaign. We partnered, interestingly enough, with Google for Entrepreneurs and with the Blackstone Foundation. And we asked people, do you know an inclusive entrepreneur, either a woman or a person of color? Tell us their stories, put their images, be a champion for them, encourage them to send us our stories. Then we partnered with Fast Company magazine, because as many of you know, if you're an entrepreneur, you're just dying to get profile from Fast Company. And they said, all right, we will take the top 20 stories that you get, and from that, we will pick 5 to profile in our magazine. And so that's what they did. So we continue this work around inclusive, and part of it is making sure we're supporting an ecosystem that's building skills and mentorship and support for entrepreneurs who aren't white men. It's, again, not an anti-white men. It's recognizing that there's a gap in the market and we're a weaker sort of economic environment because of it. So we're specifically focused in these inclusive places, but we continue to bring a spotlight and tell the stories of inclusive entrepreneurs all over the nation.
I think we're going to have some time for a few questions from the audience. I'll let you start thinking about your questions as I ask a last one. Yesterday we heard a little bit about this idea of feminine investment principles, and that investing in women can be very good, right? And making sure you have women on your board can lead to more profits and more impact.
Absolutely.
Have you found that with your investing with Case Foundation?
No question. So again, we've talked about millennials, we've talked about women. They share some things in common that I think bode really well for the future. They're very conscious consumers. In the case of millennials, they're very conscious workers or workforce, if you will. and they're conscious investors. And we're coming up on a time, you may have covered this yesterday, I didn't have the benefit of being here, with the largest wealth transfer in history. Somewhere between 30 and 40 trillion dollars will transfer. And it will transfer to millennials and women more broadly. When they look at how they want to use their capital, they bring a totally different screen to their decision making. It's part of the reason today when a widow inherits her husband's money, one of the first things she typically does is fire her wealth advisor, because she's basically making a statement that I want to do it differently. You know, Dorothy did mention that we're members of the Giving Pledge, and I work with the Next Gen group in the Giving Pledge. And they want to do it differently. They don't want to live along this track of make all the money, then when you retire, you throw it over the wall. They want to use their time. I mean, it's such a blended world for millennials. They want to use the way they work, their skills, you know, even micro giving or micro loans to make a difference along life's path, not wait till some golden moment and then say, I'm ready. So I think that bodes really well, and I think that's going to help to drive impact investing and a lot of investment in places we know it's needed that today's traditional finance world has not paid attention to.
Exciting times. I think this sector's growing. Do you have a question here?
So, I'm Meg Hubeck, and I work here at UVA, and I work with civic engagement and youth. So I'm curious with like the emphasis on STEM and the move away from teaching the social studies. How can our institutions help millennials acquire the skills to be fearless?
Right. So I don't know if everyone could hear that question because the microphone came a little bit late, but with the focus on STEM and moving a little bit away from the arts, you know, how do we adequately prepare the millennial generation? You know, I'm a big believer in what is called STEAM, which adds the arts to it. You know, I think the liberal arts do a lot in terms of even that first principle I talked about, which is big idea. Right? I mean, you immerse yourself in a creative culture, and it is out of that that you see some of these big creative ideas for where something could go. So I actually think we're doing a disservice if we've become so STEM focused that we've moved away from the creative, you know, idea. And frankly, I have to tell you that, you know, there's good news and bad news on the landscape out there. The bad news is there are fewer firms being started today. More die every day than are created. And we haven't seen that in America before. So it's a great concern. We need every young person thinking about their big ideas, thinking about, but the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs, Black women. So, you know, we're seeing some things. We don't know what the future will look like yet, but we're really hoping it's, you know, a much more diverse and creative group that comes forward.
I heard you ask about mention race and other factors, but one factor I didn't notice being mentioned, and one factor I always find concern about, particularly when someone Googles entrepreneurs, is disability.
Yeah.
You don't see anyone with white cane or et cetera, et cetera.
No, I think it's really fair. I mean, I actually think I could probably spend the next 15 minutes ticking off what we really mean by inclusive, because it does go deeper. I mean, the whole gender issue, we could go into a number of different segments that we have been focused on. And in fact, in our Faces of Founders, we spotlighted an entrepreneur with disabilities. So it's something that we have our eye on, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Thanks. It's much needed.
You have another mic over here? Or, yeah. Hi, my name's Emily Lloyd. I work for the One Love Foundation, and I was a student here. I found that as a millennial, something that you said that was really interesting, your transformational change idea was particularly the fear of failure, because I think that as a millennial, it's something that I find myself frustrated with my peers about. I don't know whether it has to deal with social media or the internet or whatever, but I've noticed that most of my friends and my peers and myself, I think, are more afraid of failure than maybe my parents' generation was. And I'm wondering what you say to people, because it's easy to say, like, don't be afraid of failure. Failure can really help you in the future, and you know, learn from experience and all of that. But it's much easier said than done. And I'm wondering what you say to people that help with that.
Yeah. So what I say to people is, I do have fear. I think almost anyone has fear of failure. Okay, I don't know anyone who goes, yeah, bring on more of that failure. It just doesn't work like that. And frankly, it sometimes gets harder the closer to success you get. When it's easiest is when you have nothing to lose. When it's hardest is when you're comfortable enough, okay? That's sometimes the hardest group to break through to. But in this particular case, I think the reality is recognize everyone has a fear of failure. Einstein said, success is failure in progress. Failure is success in progress, okay? And if we actually looked at it like that, I think we'd feel very differently. And my example I'll give to you, where I try to inspire people to please try, is I will be much more inclined to support either a nonprofit or an entrepreneur if they're on their, say, third try, and the first two didn't go so well. The last thing I'm doing is saying that's a loser. I'm saying that's someone who's learned so much. They're going to be so great this time, and they're going to be greater because they failed. And so on college campuses, like Dorothy was so sweet in the bio she read this morning, but the fact of the matter is I've read a bio that's a failure bio. It wasn't a perfect climb to sit where I am today. It was filled with potholes. I gave a whole commencement address on this. And the bottom line is we're just not comfortable as adults sometimes talking about the failures along the way that got us to where we are. So then young people look, and when they hit their first failure, they think, oh my gosh, it's over. But maybe if they knew all of us had had those moments, they would be less intimidated by that time when they stumble.
Hello, my name is Yassine. I'm from Egypt. I'm a youth worker. That's why I'm interested to understand from your research, what's the difference between millennials across countries, especially high and low income countries, and how understanding millennials should it change the way we work with youth and address them in policies and interventions? Thank you.
Yeah, so your question is a good one. And because you come from Egypt, I might also just say a word about the importance of immigrants in the story of American entrepreneurship. 40% of the Fortune 500 was started by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. In fact, most of the companies that represent the greatest value in our stock market today in the US are led or were founded by an immigrant. So let's just start with that. But to your question about millennials in other places versus millennials here, look, I don't like labels at all. Like, actually, the millennial generation is not one generation. When you peel back that onion, someone who's 36 is thinking very differently than someone who's 22. And I can relate to this because we have 5 kids in our house. The youngest is 22. The oldest is almost 30, and they resent the heck out of being sort of packaged together, if you will, because they had very different experiences that give them different perceptions. So I think even within the United States, it's not like there's one set of millennials. And as I said earlier, sometimes the qualities that, say, elites will bring are different than the qualities that those who've struggled have. So the whole box label thing, even though I've been using it through this whole talk, I think is really questionable. I do see similarities all over the world in this next generation. That being said, I really do. You know, we've traveled all over the world, and we've, you know, for instance, went across Africa looking at the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and everywhere we went, the millennials building great companies feel just exactly like the millennials building great companies anywhere else. We've stood up a venture capital fund focused on technology in the West Bank and Palestine. Again, what we see as energy and brilliance is exactly the same. And so, you know, I see differences no matter what geography I'm in, and I see similarities as well. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, Jean. My name is Jen Andrasco, and I'm the president and CEO of UVA's Alumni Association. I'm not a millennial, but I am charged in my new role to activate our millennials. And as you mentioned, with the intergenerational transfer of wealth for university to women, for universities, this is critically important because of what we know about the data, which I shared last night on a panel, that women are far more likely to give, but 75% of them would choose to give of their time or their dollars to an organization that isn't their alma mater. I'm interested to know, through your experience with higher education institutions, If you have any best practices that you could share with those of us that are wanting to engage millennials, and specifically female millennials, with their universities to create meaningful engagement that will build long-term affinity.
Right, and so this is personal. This isn't data backing what I'm going to say, okay? But I think for a lot of women who stand to inherit, what they have seen as tradition is what I call bricks and mortar philanthropy, which we know is very important on any college campus to fund the buildings, to fund the infrastructure. But I give Dorothy and others here, Susan, et cetera, real credit for this gathering, because I think the more that campuses become action tanks for these new ideas and these new ways of going forward, it will become a magnet for women. And I think we are looking out in an audience that represents one of those magnets. So I would really encourage, really become the go-to place for ideas and, as a catalyst for what the new future can look like, and engage women and make them founders in that new future. I think they just aren't as drawn to some of the, I don't want to call it ego philanthropy, but the philanthropy where it's just build that building and put my name on it and I'm done. They want to be in the mix. They want to feel like they're part of the solution. And the more a university can bring that to their giving opportunities, I think the more willing you'll find them to be.
All right, well, let's thank Jean for this.
Thank you, Christine. Fun conversation.